Anatomy and Physiology, Cerebrovascular Circulation. Today we're going to talk about the arterial blood supply and the venous drainage of the brain. Let's start with the arterial blood supply to the brain. The aortic arch gives off the brachiocephalic artery on the right, which is right here, and the common carotid artery on the left, which is right here. On the right, the brachiocephalic gives off the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. On the left, the common carotid artery gives off the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery gives off the anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery. In addition, on each side, the subclavian artery gives rise to the vertebral artery. So you got a vertebral artery here, vertebral artery here. It goes in through the C6 transverse foramen, and then these two vertebral arteries merge in the midline and give rise to the basilar artery. The basilar artery in turn gives off the right and left posterior cerebral artery. And we're going to get more into this later, but the left and right anterior cerebral arteries are connected by the anterior communicating artery. The middle cerebral artery and posterior cerebral artery are connected by the posterior communicating artery. All right. So let's talk about the circle of Willis. And essentially, the circle of Willis is formed by the circulations from the internal carotid artery and the vertebral arteries. So, as I already mentioned, the internal carotid artery gives off the anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery. So you got your internal carotid artery coming in here and giving off your middle cerebral and anterior cerebral. Again, on this side, internal carotid, which is cut off, giving rise to the middle cerebral, anterior cerebral. And as I already mentioned, the basilar artery, which as we just mentioned is formed by the fusion of the right and left vertebral arteries, gives off the right and left posterior cerebral arteries. The left and right anterior cerebral arteries are connected by the anterior communicating artery, also known as ACOM for short. So you got your anterior cerebral artery on the right, your anterior cerebral artery on the left, and you got this anterior communicating artery. And it's really a small vessel, but it's there. So these two are connected by the anterior communicating artery. The middle cerebral artery and the posterior cerebral artery are connected by the posterior communicating artery, or PCOM for short. So you got your middle cerebral, posterior cerebral, middle cerebral, posterior cerebral, connected by the posterior communicating artery here, posterior communicating artery here. So as you can see, it forms all these connections form a circle, which are called the circle of Willis. So in short, here are three major arteries to the brain: the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and posterior cerebral artery. These arteries supply different regions of the brain. And these regions of the brain are vulnerable to damage during a stroke. And a stroke is basically anything that cuts off blood supply to the brain. It can either be an ischemic stroke, which is where a blood clot blocks brain flow, or it can be a hemorrhagic stroke, where you have bleeding, which causes decreased blood flow to the brain. And this is nicely color-coded for you. So you got your middle cerebral artery territory here, posterior cerebral artery territory here, anterior cerebral artery here. It's actually pretty self-explanatory. Anterior, middle, posterior cerebral artery. So your occipital lobe is supplied mainly by the posterior cerebral artery. Portions of your frontal lobe are supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Your parts of your parietal, temporal, and frontal lobes are supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Now let's talk about the venous drainage of the brain, dural sinuses. So unlike other parts of the body, venous drainage in the brain does not directly follow the arterial blood supply. Instead, venous drainage of the brain occurs through a series of sinuses. CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, ultimately drains into the sinuses as well. So we have our superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, which drains into the straight sinus. And then you have your superior sagittal sinus and straight sinus, which join at the confluence of sinuses. Your drainage continues on each side into the transverse sinus, then sigmoid sinus, all the way into the internal jugular vein. And the same on this side, transverse sinus, sigmoid because it's S-shaped, into the internal jugular vein. So your internal jugular vein, the main purpose of the internal jugular vein is to drain blood from the brain. So if your internal carotid has the main job of supplying blood to the brain, then the internal jugular would be the venous counterpart, draining blood from the brain. It's over. Like this video, subscribe. Thank you very much.